Dr. Zyxthara adjusted the neural interface connecting her consciousness to the observation pod, her 6 arms working in practiced harmony to calibrate the equipment. The crystalline walls of the Galactic Observation Council's research vessel Eternal Watch hummed with energy as they maintained their position 3 light-minutes from Earth's solar system. Her species, the Velter, had been chosen for this mission precisely because of their reputation for clinical detachment and scientific objectivity. Their homeworld had achieved peace through logic over 2 millennia ago, and warfare had become nothing more than an abstract concept studied in historical databases. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. Humanity had recently been discovered by the Council's long-range scouts, and preliminary assessments indicated they were in the midst of what their records called World War III. The Council needed detailed behavioral analysis to determine if humans posed a threat to galactic stability once they inevitably developed faster-than-light travel. Every species that reached the stars eventually did, and humanity's rapid technological advancement suggested they would join the galactic community within the next few centuries. Zyxthara had volunteered for the mission with enthusiasm. Her doctoral thesis on primitive warfare dynamics in pre-FTL civilizations had earned recognition throughout the academic community, and she saw this as an opportunity to observe genuine military conflict rather than rely on second-hand historical accounts. The Council's xenobiologists had already confirmed that humans were remarkably similar to dozens of other species in terms of basic psychology and social structures. How different could their wars really be? The observation pod detached from the mothership with barely a whisper, its adaptive camouflage rendering it invisible to human detection systems. Zyxthara settled into the bioneural chair, feeling the pod's AI merge with her consciousness to provide real-time translation and cultural context. The journey to Earth's orbit would take 6 standard hours, giving her time to review the preliminary files. According to the initial surveys, this World War III had begun 18 months ago when a coalition of nations called the Eastern Alliance had launched simultaneous attacks on what humans termed the Western Democratic Union. The conflict had rapidly escalated from conventional warfare to something approaching total war, with both sides deploying increasingly sophisticated weapons and tactics. Casualty estimates already exceeded 50 million beings, a number that made Zyxthara's stomach turn despite her academic interest. Her own people's last war had ended with fewer than 10,000 casualties total, and that had been considered a civilization-defining tragedy that led directly to their embrace of absolute pacifism. The scale of human conflict seemed almost incomprehensible. The pod sensors came online as they entered Earth's magnetosphere, immediately beginning to scan communication networks and military frequencies. The AI began translating and cataloging thousands of conversations, news broadcasts, and official communications. Zyxthara found herself overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information streaming past her neural interface. She decided to focus on a specific theater of operations first. The European continent appeared to be experiencing some of the most intense fighting, with battle lines shifting almost daily across what had once been peaceful borders. She directed the pod to position itself above a region the humans called Central Europe, where intelligence reports indicated a major offensive was beginning. What she saw through the pod's advanced sensors immediately challenged everything she thought she understood about warfare. The human armies weren't the disorganized mobs of desperate beings she had expected. Instead, she observed complex military organizations displaying remarkable coordination and tactical sophistication. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of kilometers, maintained by millions of individuals working in perfect synchronization. Engineers constructed massive fortifications overnight, while artillery units calculated firing solutions with mathematical precision that rivaled Velter computational systems. But it wasn't the organization that surprised her most. It was the individual human soldiers. Through the pod's bioscanners, she could monitor the physiological and neurological states of the combatants below. What she discovered defied every theoretical model of warfare behavior in the Council's databases. These humans weren't fighting out of mindless aggression or primitive territorial instincts. They were afraid, terrifyingly afraid, yet they continued to advance under withering enemy fire. Their stress hormones were elevated to levels that should have caused complete system shutdown in most species, yet they functioned with deadly effectiveness. She watched a squad of soldiers advance across an open field toward an enemy position, knowing that statistical probability gave them less than a 30% survival chance. Their biometric readings showed they were fully aware of the danger, yet not one of them retreated. When their leader was struck down by enemy fire, the next human immediately assumed command and continued the assault without hesitation. This behavior violated everything Zyxthara had learned about combat psychology. Rational beings should flee when faced with overwhelming odds. They should surrender when resistance became futile. They should prioritize individual survival over abstract strategic objectives. These humans did none of those things. Over the following days, she documented incident after incident of behavior that seemed to exist outside the normal parameters of survival instinct. A medical technician ran through active fire zones to treat wounded soldiers, despite having no combat training and carrying only basic medical supplies. A group of engineers worked for 18 straight hours to repair a bridge while under constant artillery bombardment, because their commanding officer had deemed the structure strategically necessary. Most disturbing was a young human female, barely past adolescence by their species standards, who single-handedly held a defensive position against an entire enemy squad for over 2 hours after her companions had fallen. The pod scanners showed her body was operating on pure adrenaline and willpower, far beyond normal physiological limits. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found her still firing her weapon despite having sustained injuries that should have incapacitated her 20 minutes earlier. Zyxthara began to suspect that her initial assumptions about human warfare had been fundamentally flawed. These weren't primitive beings engaged in simple territorial disputes. They were exhibiting a level of tactical cooperation and individual sacrifice that exceeded anything in the Council's historical records. The realization became even more disturbing when she analyzed their strategic planning. The humans had developed military doctrines of staggering complexity, incorporating everything from orbital mechanics to psychology to quantum physics. Their generals weren't crude warlords, but sophisticated strategists who thought in terms of global logistics and multi-dimensional battlefield management. She watched one human commander coordinate an offensive involving over 2 million personnel spread across 6 different continents. The operation required split-second timing across multiple time zones, with supply chains, air support, naval movements, and ground forces all synchronized to achieve maximum strategic impact. The mathematical precision required for such coordination rivaled the planning capabilities of the Council's most advanced AI systems. Yet what truly unnerved her was how these commanders made their calculations knowing that millions of their own people would die in the process. They weighed human lives against strategic objectives with a cold rationality that somehow coexisted with genuine concern for their subordinates' welfare. It was a paradox that made her academic models break down completely. The pod's AI began flagging anomalous behavior patterns that defied classification. Human soldiers who had been fighting each other with lethal intent would immediately cooperate to rescue civilians caught in combat zones. Enemy medics were treated as non-combatants by mutual agreement, even when such restraint provided tactical disadvantages. Prisoners of war were maintained in conditions that often exceeded the care provided to their captors' own personnel. Most puzzling was their treatment of non-combatants. Despite having weapons capable of devastating entire population centers, both sides went to extraordinary lengths to minimize civilian casualties. She observed attack formations redirect away from populated areas, even when doing so compromised their missions. Air strikes were aborted at the last second when intelligence revealed the presence of non-military personnel. This restraint existed alongside brutally efficient combat operations that showed no mercy toward legitimate military targets. The same humans who diverted bombers to avoid a civilian hospital would spend weeks planning an assault that would obliterate an enemy military installation with surgical precision. Zyxthara found herself working 18-hour days just trying to catalog the contradictions. Every time she thought she understood human warfare, new observations would shatter her theoretical framework. The breaking point came when she witnessed something that should have been impossible according to every predictive model in the Council's databases. A human transport aircraft carrying wounded soldiers from both sides had been forced down in disputed territory. The crash site was strategically valuable to both armies, and tactical doctrine suggested that whoever controlled it first would gain a significant advantage in the ongoing battle for the region. Instead of racing to secure the location, both armies sent their medical personnel to treat the injured. For 6 hours, enemy medics worked side by side to save lives, sharing equipment and expertise without regard for which side their patients had been fighting for. Only after every wounded person had been evacuated did the two forces resume their attempts to control the crash site. The battle that followed was no less intense for the temporary cooperation. Within hours, many of the same individuals who had worked together to save lives were trying to kill each other with professional efficiency. Zyxthara stared at her data for hours, trying to process what she had witnessed. The humans had voluntarily reduced their tactical effectiveness and exposed themselves to additional danger for the sake of beings they had been trying to eliminate just hours earlier. It wasn't just irrational. It suggested a cognitive framework entirely outside the normal parameters of survival-driven behavior. She began accessing deeper communication networks, trying to understand the cultural and psychological foundations that could produce such contradictions. What she found in their military communications, personal messages, and official documents only deepened her confusion. These humans spoke constantly of concepts like honor, duty, and sacrifice, abstract ideals that they valued more highly than personal survival or even species continuation. Their military academies didn't just teach tactics and strategy, but philosophy and ethics. Soldiers were expected to memorize complex codes of conduct that often required them to choose certain death over personal dishonor. More disturbing was how seriously they took these concepts. She monitored disciplinary proceedings where human military personnel faced severe punishment not for failing in combat, but for failing to meet their own species' impossibly high ethical standards during warfare. A commander who achieved strategic victory through means deemed dishonorable faced greater consequences than one who failed completely while maintaining their moral principles. It was madness, and yet it worked with terrifying effectiveness. As the first week of observation concluded, Zyxthara realized that her preliminary report would have to be completely rewritten. The Council's initial assessment of humanity as a standard aggressive species with moderate threat potential was not just wrong, it was dangerously naive. These humans weren't fighting a primitive war. They were conducting the most sophisticated and morally complex military operations she had ever documented, powered by psychological drives that made them capable of almost unlimited sacrifice for abstract principles. If they ever turned those capabilities toward galactic conquest, Zyxthara wasn't sure any force in known space could stop them. But that was a concern for later analysis. For now, she had to focus on understanding what she was observing, even as every new day brought revelations that challenged her most fundamental assumptions about warfare, consciousness, and the nature of intelligent life itself. The observation mission was scheduled to last 3 months. Already, Zyxthara suspected that wouldn't be nearly enough time to comprehend what humanity truly was. And in the deepest recesses of her scientific mind, a small voice was beginning to whisper that perhaps some knowledge was too dangerous to acquire. Dr. Zyxthara had been observing human warfare for 3 weeks when she encountered her first truly incomprehensible phenomenon. She had thought she was beginning to understand the patterns of human military behavior, cataloging their tactical innovations, and documenting their peculiar ethical frameworks. But nothing had prepared her for what the humans called special operations. The pod's sensors locked onto a small team of 12 humans moving through hostile territory deep behind enemy lines. According to intercepted communications, their mission was to destroy a strategic communications facility that coordinated enemy air defenses across half a continent. The target was protected by nearly 1,000 soldiers, automated defense systems, and enough firepower to level a small city. Any rational species would have assigned at least a full division to such a task, tens of thousands of soldiers with heavy equipment and massive logistical support. The humans had sent 12 individuals with gear that weighed less than what most species used for recreational camping. Zyxthara watched in fascination as the team infiltrated the facility's perimeter. Their approach wasn't just tactically sound. It was a masterpiece of applied physics, psychology, and engineering. They moved through the darkness using modified human biology, enhanced reflexes, improved night vision, and metabolic alterations that allowed them to function at peak efficiency for extended periods. But the biological modifications were nothing compared to their technological integration. Each human carried equipment that represented the cutting edge of their species' engineering capabilities. Weapons that could penetrate any known armor, communication devices that operated on quantum-encrypted frequencies, and portable computers with processing power that rivaled some of the Council's research installations. What disturbed Zyxthara most was how naturally they used this technology. The equipment wasn't just tools to them. It was an extension of their own bodies and minds. They thought and moved as a single organism, communicating through subtle gestures and electromagnetic signals that created a real-time tactical network. She monitored their biometrics as they approached the target facility. Unlike regular soldiers, these humans showed no elevation in stress hormones. Their heart rates remained steady, their neural patterns calm and focused. They were walking into a situation that would terrify most sentient beings, and they were as relaxed as if they were taking a casual stroll. The assault itself lasted 18 minutes. Zyxthara watched the entire operation through multiple sensor arrays, and she still couldn't fully comprehend what she had witnessed. The 12 humans moved through the facility like a force of nature, neutralizing opposition with surgical precision while avoiding casualties among non-essential personnel. They destroyed their primary target, eliminated 3 secondary objectives that hadn't even been mentioned in their mission briefing, and extracted with 0 friendly casualties. More disturbing was what happened afterward. The enemy forces spent 3 hours searching for the infiltration team, deploying thousands of soldiers and advanced detection equipment. They found no trace of the humans' presence except for the destroyed communications hub. 12 beings had penetrated a facility defended by nearly 1,000, accomplished their mission with perfect success, and vanished without leaving evidence they had ever been there. It was the kind of operation that should have required months of planning and massive resource expenditure. According to the intercepted mission logs, the humans had planned it in 6 hours and executed it with equipment they carried in their personal gear. Zyxthara began investigating these special operations forces more thoroughly, accessing personnel records and training documentation. What she discovered challenged her understanding of biological limitations. These humans underwent training regimens that should have killed them, physical conditioning that pushed their bodies beyond normal tolerances, psychological preparation that involved deliberate exposure to extreme stress, and educational programs that crammed decades of specialized knowledge into compressed timeframes. Most species would consider such training methods torture. The humans volunteered for them. She watched training footage from their military academies, where volunteers subjected themselves to scenarios designed to break their minds and bodies. Sleep deprivation, extreme temperatures, simulated combat with live ammunition, and psychological pressure that would shatter most beings' sanity. Those who survived emerged as something beyond normal human capability. They could function effectively in any environment, adapt to rapidly changing circumstances, and accomplish missions that seemed physically impossible. More importantly, they could do all of this while maintaining the ethical frameworks that governed regular human military operations. Zyxthara observed a special operations team extract civilians from a besieged city, fighting their way through hostile territory while protecting refugees who slowed their movement and compromised their operational security. They could have accomplished their primary mission faster and safer by abandoning the non-combatants, but their cultural programming made such an option literally unthinkable. The rescue operation took 18 hours and involved fighting through 3 enemy divisions. The team suffered casualties that would have broken the morale of most military units. Yet they completed their mission successfully, delivering over 200 civilians to safety while simultaneously gathering intelligence that enabled a larger strategic victory. What made this even more remarkable was that the civilians they rescued weren't even from their own nation. They were enemy non-combatants caught in the crossfire of the larger war, with no strategic value and no political importance. The humans had risked their lives for abstract moral principles that provided no tactical advantage. This pattern of behavior appeared throughout human special operations. Missions were regularly modified or complicated by ethical considerations that reduced efficiency and increased danger. Yet somehow, These constraints seemed to make the humans more effective, not less. Zyxthara spent days analyzing the psychological profiles of these elite soldiers, trying to understand what drove them to such extremes. Their personnel files revealed individuals with exceptional intelligence and physical capability, but that alone couldn't explain their performance. The key seemed to be what humans called motivation. These warriors weren't fighting for territory, resources, or even species survival. They were fighting for concepts, freedom, justice, protection of the innocent, that existed only in their collective consciousness. More puzzling was how they maintained these motivations despite experiencing the horrors of warfare firsthand. She monitored communications between special operations personnel who had seen their friends die, witnessed atrocities committed by both sides, and endured physical and psychological trauma that would destroy most beings. Instead of becoming cynical or desensitized, they seemed to become more committed to their abstract ideals. Trauma that should have broken them only strengthened their resolve to protect others from similar experiences. Zyxthara documented case after case of humans who had suffered devastating losses, yet continued to volunteer for increasingly dangerous missions. A sniper whose entire family had been killed in enemy bombardment, who continued to serve with lethal efficiency while using his position to protect civilian evacuation routes. A demolitions expert who had lost both legs to an enemy mine, who insisted on returning to active duty and developed new techniques for operating while disabled. The psychological resilience displayed by these humans exceeded any theoretical models in the Council's databases. They should have succumbed to what their own psychologists termed post-traumatic stress disorder. Yet they continued to function at peak effectiveness while processing emotional damage that would incapacitate most species. Even more disturbing was their capacity for growth under pressure. Extended combat operations didn't degrade their performance, it enhanced it. Teams that had been deployed for months in hostile territory showed improved coordination, enhanced tactical awareness, and expanded operational capabilities. They were becoming more effective through exposure to the very conditions that should have destroyed them. Zyxthara began to understand why the preliminary council assessment had labeled humanity as a moderate threat. The analysts had looked at human technology, population numbers, and territorial expansion rates, all metrics that suggested a species well within normal parameters. They had completely failed to assess human adaptability. These beings didn't just use tools, they became their tools. Their military equipment wasn't separate from them, it was integrated into their consciousness and physiology. Their tactics weren't rigid doctrines but living systems that evolved in real time. Their soldiers weren't just warriors but philosophers, engineers, and artists who brought creative thinking to every aspect of warfare. Most terrifying was their capacity for geometric improvement. Every engagement taught them something new. Every defeat was analyzed and incorporated into improved strategies. Every victory was dissected to understand what could be done better next time. They were learning, not just accumulating experience, but actually evolving their military capabilities through exposure to conflict. Weapons systems that had been theoretical concepts at the beginning of the war were being field-tested within months. Tactical doctrines were rewritten based on real-time battlefield feedback. Training programs incorporated lessons learned from recent operations. Zyxthara watched human military effectiveness increase week by week, as if the war itself was accelerating their development. Technologies that should have taken decades to mature were being deployed within months. Strategies that required massive computational resources were being executed by individual commanders using intuitive decision-making. The humans were becoming more dangerous the longer they fought. She documented their rapid development of countermeasures for every new threat they encountered. Enemy weapons systems were analyzed, reverse-engineered, and improved upon within weeks of first contact. Tactical innovations were disseminated throughout their entire military structure and adapted to local conditions with remarkable speed. But the technological advancement was secondary to the psychological evolution she was witnessing. Human soldiers were developing new forms of combat awareness that seemed to transcend normal consciousness. Teams operated with coordination that approached telepathy. Individual warriors displayed situational awareness that exceeded their sensory capabilities. They were becoming something new. Zyxthara realized that her observation mission was documenting not just a war, but the transformation of an entire species. The conflict was forcing accelerated evolution in every aspect of human military capability, from technology to tactics to consciousness itself. And they showed no signs of reaching their limits. Every time she thought she had cataloged the full extent of human potential, new data would arrive that expanded her estimates. Special operations teams accomplishing missions that violated physics. Commanders coordinating operations that exceeded theoretical complexity limits. Individual soldiers performing feats that challenged the basic assumptions of biological capability. The war was making them stronger, smarter, and more dangerous with each passing day. As she completed her analysis of the special operations data, Zyxthara felt a chill of premonition. If these humans ever directed their evolving capabilities toward galactic expansion, they wouldn't just be another species joining the Council. They would reshape the entire galactic community according to their own incomprehensible principles. And looking at their track record of technological adaptation and psychological resilience, she wasn't confident that any existing force could prevent them from doing exactly that. The revelation that changed everything came during Zyxthara's 5th week of observation, when she witnessed something that shattered every assumption she had made about the limits of human warfare. The Eastern Alliance had developed what their intelligence services called a planet-killer weapon, a massive orbital bombardment system capable of devastating entire continents. The device had been constructed in secret over the previous 6 months, using advanced physics principles that approached the Council's own technological capabilities. Intelligence suggested it would be operational within days. The Western Democratic Union faced an impossible strategic situation. Their military analysts calculated that conventional forces had zero probability of reaching the weapon before it became operational. The target was located in the most heavily defended region of enemy territory, protected by integrated air defenses, multiple army groups, and geographical barriers that made approach virtually impossible. Any rational species would have surrendered or sought negotiated terms. The humans chose a third option that existed completely outside standard military doctrine. They decided to volunteer. Zyxthara initially didn't understand what she was observing. Military communications indicated that the Western Union was requesting volunteers for a mission with zero probability of survival and minimal chance of success. According to her translation matrices, this was essentially asking for soldiers to commit suicide for a tactical objective that probably couldn't be achieved anyway. She expected perhaps a few dozen responses from individuals with nothing left to lose, desperate soldiers seeking meaningful death or fanatics driven by extremist ideology. Instead, she documented over 2 million applications within the first 6 hours. The entire available military force of the Western Union had volunteered for a suicide mission. Not just combat personnel, but support staff, logistics specialists, engineers, medical personnel, and administrative workers. Beings whose primary military role was maintaining supply lines or repairing equipment were requesting assignment to an operation that would certainly kill them. More disturbing was the nature of their applications. These weren't desperate or fatalistic communications, but carefully reasoned arguments for why each individual could contribute to the mission's success. Engineers explained how their specialized knowledge could help overcome specific defensive obstacles. Medical personnel outlined ways they could extend the operational capability of assault teams. Logistics specialists described methods for maintaining supply chains during extended operations behind enemy lines. They were treating certain death as a technical problem to be solved through professional expertise. Zyxthara accessed the personal files of randomly selected applicants, trying to understand what drove this unprecedented response. What she found challenged her understanding of individual survival instinct. A female pilot with 3 young offspring had volunteered because her expertise in atmospheric flight systems could improve the mission's chance of success by an estimated 0.3%. A male engineer with recently bonded mate had applied because his knowledge of enemy construction techniques might help breach their defensive installations. A logistics coordinator responsible for feeding thousands of soldiers had requested assignment because his organizational skills could extend the operational timeline by several hours. These humans had meaningful lives, personal relationships, and responsibilities that should have motivated self-preservation. Yet they were willing to abandon everything for fractional improvements in a mission's probability of success. The selection process revealed even more disturbing aspects of human psychology. Military planners didn't choose volunteers based on expendability or lack of alternatives. Instead, they selected individuals whose skills and knowledge would maximize the mission's effectiveness, even if this meant sacrificing their most valuable personnel. The final assault force consisted of over 50,000 humans, representing the absolute best of their military capabilities. Scientists, engineers, tactical specialists, and combat veterans whose combined knowledge and experience represented centuries of accumulated expertise. They were volunteering to throw away irreplaceable human resources for a single operation. Zyxthara monitored their preparation phases, expecting to see psychological breakdown as the reality of their situation became apparent. Instead, she observed the most efficient and innovative military planning she had yet documented. These humans weren't just accepting death, they were optimizing for it. Engineering teams developed new technologies specifically designed for single-use operations. Equipment that would provide maximum effectiveness while ignoring durability or maintenance requirements. Weapons systems that sacrificed operator safety for increased firepower. Transportation methods that prioritized mission success over crew survival. They were weaponizing their own mortality. The tactical planning sessions revealed strategic thinking that transcended normal military doctrine. Operations were designed with the assumption that all personnel would be lost, which eliminated constraints that typically limited mission scope. Resources could be expended without regard for future operations. Equipment could be destroyed to achieve tactical objectives. Personnel could be deployed in ways that guaranteed casualties but maximized strategic impact. What emerged was a military operation unlike anything in the Council's historical databases. The humans had designed a campaign that treated their own forces as expendable ammunition, precisely targeting enemy weaknesses while accepting predetermined losses that would horrify any rational strategic planner. Yet the mathematics worked. Computer simulations suggested that this approach actually increased the mission's probability of success from 0 to nearly 15%. By accepting certain death for all participants, the humans had found tactical options that conventional military planning couldn't access. They were trading lives for probability improvements with the precision of an engineering equation. The assault began at dawn on the 43rd day of Zyxthara's observation period. She watched 50,000 humans launch themselves against fortified positions that should have stopped 10 times their number. The initial attack waves were designed to exhaust enemy defensive systems, with follow-up forces exploiting the temporary windows created by their predecessor's sacrifice. It was the most coldly calculated operation she had ever witnessed, and yet it was executed with passionate intensity that defied description. Human soldiers advanced under weapons fire that vaporized their companions, maintaining formation discipline and tactical coordination even as their units suffered casualties that exceeded 100%. New personnel seamlessly replaced fallen leaders, continuing operations without pause or hesitation. Aircraft pilots flew bombing runs that required them to collide with enemy installations, timing their final maneuvers to maximize explosive impact. Ground forces assaulted defensive positions using tactics that guaranteed their destruction, but created gaps for subsequent waves to exploit. Engineers constructed bridges and roadways while under direct fire, completing essential infrastructure even as they were systematically eliminated by enemy countermeasures. Communications specialists maintained network connectivity by physically replacing destroyed equipment until they themselves were killed, ensuring that tactical coordination continued throughout the operation. Each death served a specific tactical purpose, calculated to advance the overall mission objectives by measurable increments. Zyxthara watched this systematic expenditure of human life with growing horror and fascination. These beings had industrialized their own destruction, turning individual mortality into a precision weapon deployed with mathematical accuracy. After 18 hours of continuous combat, the impossible happened. A surviving human assault team reached the orbital weapon facility. The final phase of the operation involved 12 humans, the last survivors of a 50,000-person force, infiltrating the most heavily defended installation on the planet. They had fought their way through 3 defensive lines, crossed 200 kilometers of hostile territory, and overcome automated systems designed to stop armies. Zyxthara monitored their biometrics as they entered the facility. These humans were operating on pure willpower, their bodies sustained by combat drugs and psychological determination that exceeded biological limits. They had been fighting continuously for nearly a full day, suffering injuries that should have incapacitated them hours earlier. Yet they moved through the facility with precision that hadn't degraded despite exhaustion, trauma, and overwhelming odds. They located the weapons control systems, bypassed defensive countermeasures that had required months to design, and initiated destruction sequences that would eliminate the strategic threat. The facility's self-destruct sequence activated just as enemy reinforcements arrived. The 12 humans had accomplished their mission, but escape was impossible. They had always known this moment would come. Their entire strategy had been built around the assumption that success would cost everything. Zyxthara expected them to feel despair, fear, or at least regret as they faced inevitable death. Instead, their communications showed satisfaction and pride. They had accomplished something that military theorists had declared impossible. 50,000 humans had died, but they had succeeded in protecting their species and allies from a weapon that could have killed billions. In their minds, it was an acceptable trade. The final explosion eliminated the orbital weapon, its control facility, and the last human survivors of the mission. Strategic analysis confirmed that the threat had been completely neutralized. The Eastern Alliance had lost their ultimate weapon and would require years to develop a replacement. The operation had succeeded beyond even the humans' optimistic projections. They had achieved total strategic victory through total tactical sacrifice. Zyxthara spent the following days analyzing communication intercepts from both sides of the conflict, trying to understand the implications of what she had witnessed. The Eastern Alliance military leadership was clearly shaken by the operation's success, but their reaction revealed something even more disturbing. They weren't surprised by the humans' willingness to sacrifice themselves. They were implementing their own volunteer programs for similar operations. Both sides had the same capacity for systematic self-destruction in service of strategic objectives. This wasn't a unique capability of one human faction. It was a species-wide trait that emerged when their survival was threatened. All humans, regardless of political affiliation or cultural background, could transform their individual mortality into collective strategic power. They were a species that could literally weaponize their own extinction. The implications were staggering. Any conflict with humanity would involve opponents who could and would sacrifice everything to achieve their objectives. Their losses would only make them more dangerous, as survivors gained tactical knowledge while maintaining their willingness to die for abstract principles. Traditional military doctrine assumed that escalating casualties would eventually force rational surrender. Humans seemed to escalate their commitment in proportion to their losses, becoming more determined as their situation became more desperate. Zyxthara realized that her observation mission was documenting something unprecedented in galactic history, a species that had evolved warfare beyond the normal constraints of survival instinct. They had developed cultural and psychological mechanisms that could override biological programming when necessary. They were simultaneously the most rational and most irrational beings she had ever studied. As she compiled her data on the orbital weapon mission, Zyxthara couldn't escape a growing sense of unease. The humans hadn't just won an impossible victory. They had demonstrated capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about the limits of military power. If they ever directed these capabilities toward galactic expansion, traditional diplomatic and military responses would be completely inadequate. The Council would need entirely new frameworks for dealing with a species that could turn defeat into victory through sheer determination to accept unacceptable losses. The transformation began during Zyxthara's 7th week of observation, when she started detecting anomalous patterns in human military communications that suggested something fundamental had changed in their approach to warfare. The initial signs were subtle, Minor modifications in tactical doctrine, slight shifts in resource allocation, and new technological developments that seem to appear without corresponding research phases. She first noticed it in their supply chain logistics. Human armies had always demonstrated impressive organizational capabilities, but now they were achieving coordination levels that approached theoretical perfection. Supplies arrived exactly when needed, equipment replacements materialized before failures occurred, and personnel transfers happened with mathematical precision that eliminated all inefficiency. The logistics networks were functioning as if they possessed predictive capabilities. Deeper investigation revealed that human military planners had developed something they called integrated battlefield awareness, a system that combined artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and human intuition to create real-time tactical omniscience. Every soldier, vehicle, and equipment piece was connected to a collective intelligence network that processed information faster than individual consciousness could comprehend. But this wasn't just advanced technology. The humans had found ways to merge their biological consciousness with their computational systems, creating hybrid intelligence that exceeded the capabilities of either component alone. Zyxthara watched field commanders make strategic decisions that incorporated thousands of variables in real time, processing battlefield data with speed and accuracy that matched the Council's most sophisticated AI systems. Yet these decisions retained distinctly human characteristics, creative leaps of logic, intuitive assessments of psychological factors, and ethical considerations that no artificial intelligence could replicate. They had created a form of collective consciousness that preserved individual identity while enabling unprecedented coordination. She monitored a division-sized operation where 30,000 human soldiers operated as a single organism, each individual maintaining their personality and decision-making autonomy while contributing to collective tactical awareness that spanned hundreds of kilometers. Communication between units happened instantaneously, with strategic adjustments implemented across the entire force faster than neural transmission should allow. The effect was like watching 30,000 minds think as one while remaining 30,000 separate beings. The technological implications were staggering, but the psychological aspects were even more disturbing. Human soldiers weren't losing their individuality to this collective awareness. They were expanding it. Personal experience was shared across the network, allowing everyone to benefit from specialized knowledge and tactical insights that would normally require years to accumulate. A young soldier could access the combat experience of veteran warriors through the neural link. Engineers shared design innovations instantaneously across all units. Medical personnel distributed treatment protocols in real time as new injuries were encountered. The entire military force was learning and adapting as a unified intelligence while maintaining the creative chaos that made humans so effective. But the most unsettling discovery came when Zyxthara realized that this collective consciousness extended beyond immediate battlefield applications. The humans were using their integrated awareness to redesign their entire civilization's approach to warfare. Manufacturing facilities operated with perfect efficiency, producing equipment precisely tailored to specific tactical requirements. Research laboratories shared data instantaneously, accelerating technological development at exponential rates. Training programs incorporated real-time battlefield feedback, creating educational systems that evolved continuously based on current operational needs. The entire human species was becoming a military organism optimized for warfare. Zyxthara documented changes that were happening too rapidly for natural social evolution. Cultural patterns that typically required generations to develop were emerging within weeks. New technologies appeared fully mature without apparent testing phases. Strategic doctrines evolved in real time based on immediate battlefield feedback. They were undergoing controlled evolution, guided by collective intelligence. The changes weren't limited to military capabilities. Human society was restructuring itself to support their enhanced warfare potential. Economic systems reorganized to prioritize strategic resource allocation. Educational institutions modified curricula to emphasize tactical thinking and technological innovation. Even artistic expression began incorporating themes of collective purpose and strategic thinking. Every aspect of human civilization was being optimized for conflict effectiveness. What made this transformation even more remarkable was that it preserved the ethical frameworks that had made human warfare so distinctive. The collective consciousness enhanced their moral reasoning rather than eliminating it. Decisions that affected millions of people were made with consideration for individual rights and ethical principles that became more sophisticated rather than simplified. They were becoming simultaneously more unified and more individually conscious. Zixthara observed decision-making processes where collective intelligence analyzed strategic options, while individual moral reasoning evaluated their ethical implications. Military operations were planned with unprecedented efficiency, while maintaining humanitarian constraints that actually became more stringent as their capabilities expanded. The humans were using their collective consciousness to become more human, not less. She documented operations where this enhanced collective capability demonstrated its full potential. A strategic campaign that required coordination across multiple continents, involving millions of personnel and complex technological systems that had to function in perfect synchronization. The operation succeeded with efficiency that exceeded theoretical possibilities. Every component of the massive military machine functioned exactly as planned, with adaptive responses to unexpected complications that happened faster than normal command structures could possibly react. Yet the campaign also demonstrated ethical restraint and humanitarian consideration that surpassed anything she had previously observed. They had achieved perfect military efficiency while becoming more morally advanced. The enemy forces found themselves facing opponents who seemed to anticipate their every move while responding to tactical changes faster than information could travel. Human commanders knew what their opponents would do before the decisions were made, while simultaneously developing countermeasures that addressed not just immediate tactical problems, but strategic implications that extended months into the future. It was like watching beings who existed partially outside normal space-time constraints. But the most disturbing aspect of this transformation was its exponential acceleration. The collective consciousness wasn't just improving human military capability, it was accelerating the rate of improvement itself. New developments led to enhanced collective awareness, which enabled faster development cycles, which produced more advanced capabilities, which further enhanced their collective intelligence. They were locked in a positive feedback loop of expanding capability. Zixthara calculated development curves that suggested human military effectiveness was improving at rates that violated normal technological advancement patterns. Capabilities that should require decades to mature were appearing within weeks. Strategic innovations were being implemented faster than they could be properly tested. Yet somehow, every new development worked perfectly. The collective consciousness wasn't just thinking faster, it was thinking better. Creative solutions emerged from the interaction between individual human intuition and collective computational power that exceeded what either could achieve alone. Problems that would challenge the Council's greatest minds were being solved routinely by human field commanders who had access to species-wide knowledge and experience. They were becoming something beyond the normal limits of biological intelligence. The implications for galactic security were becoming clear. If humanity ever developed faster than light travel, they wouldn't enter galactic civilization as another species seeking membership in the Council. They would arrive as a collective consciousness with military capabilities that exceeded anything in known space, guided by ethical frameworks that would make them impossible to predict or control. Traditional diplomatic approaches assumed individual leaders who could be negotiated with, influenced, or, if necessary, eliminated. The humans were evolving beyond such vulnerabilities. Their collective consciousness meant that removing any individual, even their highest leaders, wouldn't affect their strategic capabilities. They were becoming invulnerable to conventional intelligence operations. Worse, their collective consciousness was continuing to evolve. Each week brought new capabilities that expanded their tactical possibilities. Zixthara documented improvements in their predictive algorithms, enhancement of their technological integration, and expansion of their collective awareness to include civilian populations. The entire human species was becoming a military intelligence network. Yet they maintained individual personalities, creative chaos, and ethical principles that made them even more effective rather than reducing them to mechanical efficiency. The collective consciousness enhanced human nature instead of replacing it, creating beings who were more individually capable while being perfectly coordinated. They were evolving into something that combined the best aspects of individual consciousness with the power of unified intelligence. As Zyxthara compiled her data on human collective consciousness, she realized that her observations were documenting not just a war, but the birth of a new form of life. The humans weren't just fighting more effectively, they were becoming something unprecedented in galactic history. A species-wide intelligence that preserved individual identity while achieving perfect coordination. A collective consciousness that enhanced rather than suppressed creativity and moral reasoning. A military organization that spanned an entire civilization while maintaining the ethical frameworks that made them distinctly human. If they ever turned their attention to galactic expansion, they wouldn't just conquer through superior technology or overwhelming force. They would absorb other civilizations into their collective consciousness, spreading their enhanced capabilities and ethical frameworks throughout known space. The Council had protocols for dealing with aggressive species, technological threats, and even psychic entities that could influence other minds. They had no framework for handling a collective consciousness that enhanced rather than dominated individual identity while creating military capabilities that exceeded all known limits. Humanity wasn't just becoming more dangerous, they were becoming incomprehensible. And Zyxthara was beginning to suspect that incomprehensible might be more terrifying than any conventional threat the galaxy had ever faced. The end came not with the dramatic conclusion Zyxthara had expected, but with a moment of perfect silence that made her neural interface scream warnings about system malfunction. She had been monitoring what should have been the war's climactic battle, two massive armies converging on a strategic region that would determine the conflict's outcome. Millions of humans had been positioning for weeks, deploying weapons systems that approached the Council's own technological capabilities, preparing for a confrontation that would reshape their planet's political structure. Then at exactly 14:23:07 local time, every human military unit on Earth stopped moving. Not retreated, not surrendered, simply stopped as if some universal signal had reached every soldier simultaneously. Weapons powered down, vehicles halted, aircraft landed at the nearest suitable locations. Millions of humans stood motionless in perfect coordination that spanned the globe. For 17 minutes, the entire planet was silent. Zyxthara frantically checked her equipment, convinced that some technical failure was preventing her from detecting ongoing military activity. The pod's sensors functioned perfectly, communications networks remained active, and environmental monitoring showed normal patterns. Yet every indication of warfare had simply ceased. Then the communications began. Not military orders or tactical updates, but conversations. Humans were talking to each other across battle lines that had been inviolable minutes earlier. Enemy soldiers were sharing water and medical supplies. Officers from opposing forces were collaborating on humanitarian operations to assist civilian populations caught in combat zones. The war had ended without victory, surrender, or negotiation. Zyxthara accessed communication networks frantically, trying to understand what had caused this unprecedented transformation. What she discovered challenged every assumption she had made about the nature of consciousness, warfare, and the limits of collective intelligence. The human collective consciousness had reached a critical threshold where continued warfare became impossible. Their integrated awareness had evolved to the point where every human could directly experience the perspectives of their opponents. Soldiers could feel their enemies' fear, understand their motivations, and recognize their fundamental humanity. Military commanders could perceive the strategic futility of continued conflict from all possible viewpoints simultaneously. They had become psychologically incapable of dehumanizing each other. But this wasn't simple pacifism or war exhaustion. The humans retained all their tactical capabilities, technological advantages, and strategic intelligence. They had simply transcended the psychological foundations that made warfare possible between conscious beings who truly understood each other. Through their collective consciousness, they had achieved what their philosophers called perfect empathy, the ability to experience another being's perspective so completely that causing unnecessary suffering became impossible. Not because of external moral constraints, but because harming others literally meant harming aspects of their own expanded consciousness. They had evolved beyond the capacity for intraspecies warfare. The transformation continued as Zyxthara watched. Military units reorganized themselves into humanitarian operations with efficiency that exceeded their previous combat effectiveness. Weapons systems were converted into construction equipment. Soldiers became engineers, teachers, and medical personnel who retained their discipline and coordination while redirecting their collective capabilities toward constructive purposes. The same collective consciousness that had made them the most effective warriors she had ever observed was now making them the most effective civilization builders in galactic history. But the implications extended far beyond Earth's local conflicts. The collective consciousness wasn't limited to human military personnel. It was expanding throughout their entire population. Civilians were gaining access to the enhanced awareness that had made their soldiers so formidable, while maintaining their individual personalities and creative independence. Humanity was becoming a species-wide collective consciousness that preserved individual identity while enabling perfect cooperation. Zyxthara watched them rebuild their war-damaged infrastructure with coordination that made their military operations seem primitive by comparison. Construction projects that should have required decades were completed in weeks. Technological innovations emerged from the collaboration between millions of enhanced minds working in perfect synchronization. They were applying military-level collective intelligence to civilization development. The results were staggering. Environmental restoration projects that addressed damage from centuries of industrial development. Educational systems that adapted in real time to individual learning patterns while maintaining collective knowledge standards. Economic structures that optimized resource distribution while preserving individual choice and creativity. They were solving civilization-scale problems with the same efficiency they had applied to tactical challenges. But the most disturbing discovery came when Zyxthara realized that their collective consciousness was still evolving. The end of warfare hadn't been a goal they had achieved. It was a byproduct of expansion that was continuing to accelerate. Their enhanced awareness was approaching capabilities that existed outside normal space-time constraints. She documented instances of collective decision-making that seemed to incorporate information from probable future states. Strategic planning that accounted for consequences extending centuries into the future. Technological developments that anticipated problems that hadn't yet emerged. They were beginning to think in temporal dimensions that exceeded normal consciousness. Even more unsettling was evidence that their collective consciousness was starting to extend beyond their planetary boundaries. Communication networks showed coordination patterns that suggested awareness of events in their solar system before light-speed transmission could possibly deliver that information. Their collective intelligence was expanding faster than the speed of light. Zyxthara realized with growing horror that she was no longer observing human warfare. She was documenting the emergence of something that transcended the normal categories of biological intelligence. The humans were becoming a distributed consciousness that operated according to principles that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of mind, identity, and reality itself. And they were doing it while preserving everything that had made them distinctly human. The collective consciousness enhanced rather than eliminated individual personality. Creative chaos increased rather than decreased as millions of minds contributed to innovative solutions. Ethical reasoning became more sophisticated rather than simplified as expanded awareness enabled consideration of consequences that individual consciousness couldn't comprehend. They were becoming more human, not less, while transcending the biological limitations of individual existence. The pod's long-range sensors began detecting anomalous readings from the edges of Earth's solar system, structures that hadn't existed days earlier, energy patterns that suggested technology beyond anything humans had previously demonstrated, communication networks that operated on principles that violated known physics. The collective consciousness wasn't just improving human capability, it was enabling technological development that should have required centuries of research. Zyxthara checked her mission timeline and realized she had been observing for exactly 3 months. According to her original orders, she should begin preparation for return to the Council's research vessel. The preliminary report on human warfare capabilities was due within days. But the beings she had been sent to study no longer existed. The humans she had observed 3 months ago were individual biological entities engaged in primitive territorial warfare using conventional weapons and tactics. The consciousness that now inhabited Earth was something entirely unprecedented. A collective intelligence that spanned an entire species while preserving individual identity, operated according to principles that transcended normal space-time limitations, and demonstrated technological capabilities that rivaled the Council's most advanced civilizations. Her original mission parameters had become meaningless. More disturbing was the growing suspicion that her observation efforts hadn't gone unnoticed. Communication patterns suggested that the human collective consciousness was aware of her presence and had been for some time. They hadn't responded to surveillance because they had chosen not to, not because they lacked the capability to detect her. She was being observed by the being she had been sent to observe. The pod's proximity alarms activated as something approached from Earth's direction. Zyxthara's sensors detected a craft that shouldn't have been possible according to human technological assessments from even weeks earlier. The vessel operated on principles that suggested mastery of physics concepts that the Council's most advanced researchers were only beginning to understand. A communication request arrived through channels that her equipment shouldn't have been able to receive. The message was formatted perfectly for her species' neural interface protocols, despite humans having no previous contact with Velter technology. They knew exactly what she was and how to communicate with her. The message was simple. Dr. Zyxthara, we have been aware of your observation mission since your arrival. We would like to invite you to visit our planet for direct communication. Your safety and eventual return to your people is guaranteed. They were inviting her to make first contact. Zyxthara stared at the communication for what felt like hours, trying to comprehend the implications. The beings she had been sent to study as a potential threat to galactic stability were now technologically advanced enough to detect Council surveillance equipment, intellectually sophisticated enough to reverse-engineer alien communication protocols, and ethically developed enough to offer diplomatic contact with their observers. In 3 months, they had evolved from a warlike species barely capable of orbital flight to a collective consciousness with capabilities that might exceed the Council's greatest civilizations. And they were offering to talk. The mission parameters said nothing about first contact protocols. Zyxthara had been sent to observe and report, not to engage in diplomatic relations with the subjects of her study. Making contact would violate every regulation governing Council intelligence operations. But refusing might be the last mistake the galactic community ever made. These humans had demonstrated capabilities that could reshape the galaxy if they chose to expand beyond their solar system. They had also shown ethical development that suggested such expansion would be guided by principles that preserved rather than destroyed existing civilizations. The choice was between filing a report that would terrify the Council into potentially disastrous preemptive action, or making contact with beings who might represent the next stage of galactic civilization. Zyxthara initiated the communication protocols that would signal her acceptance of their invitation. She was no longer just an observer. She was about to become the first representative of galactic civilization to meet humanity as equals. And despite everything she had witnessed over the past 3 months, she still had no idea what she would find when she reached Earth. The only certainty was that the galaxy would never be the same.